And welcome to the second hearing of the City Council's Ad Hoc Committee on Film and Television Production Jobs. Today is Friday, March 21st, 2014. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee, and I'm joined by my colleague, Mitch O'Farrell of the 13th Council District, including Hollywood. And we will be spending this hearing talking primarily about California's film and television production tax incentive, the existing program and the impacts that it has had on our economy and stemming runaway production, additional steps that the state can be taking in order to facilitate our efforts to keep jobs here, and the current legislative efforts that are underway in Sacramento as well. And we have as our special guest today Assemblymember Raul Bocanegra, who is the author of AB 1839, and he will be speaking about that legislation and other updates from Sacramento as we move forward. So before I begin, Mr. O'Farrell, I'd like to offer you the opportunity for any introductory comments that you might want to make at this point, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Be very brief. I also welcome Assemblymember Bocanegra. Thank you so much. I look forward to your presentation, and I want to commend the Milken Institute for your report that I'm just now kind of getting into. So I think we're getting somewhere with this, and I'm happy to be here and like my colleague, explore every possibility that we can to not only stop the bleeding of jobs, but make the industry stronger in Los Angeles than it's ever been. And I think we'll be able to do it. We have the talent, the ability, and everyone wants to stay in Los Angeles. We just have to figure out how to make it work. So thank you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you. So just to kind of, excuse the pun, but set the stage here. California began experiencing significant loss of jobs in the film and television production industry about 15 or so years ago when Canada led the way with its incentive program. And since that time, over 40 other states have enacted lucrative tax incentives to try to take California jobs away. And many have succeeded in doing so, and we've experienced the consequences here ever since. Throughout most of that time, California gave lip service to the problem of runaway production, but frankly didn't do very much about it. Unfortunately, our state sat on its laurels and assumed that the fact that this was the heritage industry that had always been here, or at least had been here since we took it away from New York, that it would always be here. And we suffered the consequences. During that time, beginning in 2000, with AB 358 by Scott Wildman and Sheila Kuehl, there were no less than 7 or 8 legislative efforts to enact tax credit or grant or loan programs to try to help keep jobs here. Every single one of those efforts failed. Everyone failed, and almost all of them failed after having been introduced in the Assembly. Almost all of them failed in the State Senate. So it was not until 2009 when, after several years of effort, we were able to enact, when I was then a member of the state legislature, we were able to enact AB X315, which initiated the California Film and Television Production Tax Incentive. Many of the folks who are sitting in this room today helped us enact that bill, and it was an important step forward, and I was proud to have been the author of that bill, but we knew at the time that that was not going to be enough. It was what we could get, but it was not going to be enough to solve the problem. And so we're going to be hearing more about the impacts that the current production incentive has, but we're also going to be hearing about what more we need to do. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing work and the historic work of our colleague, Councilmember Felipe Fuentes, who is here with us today, who's been a champion of this industry as a member of the council, but even more importantly, as before he was here, when he was a member of the State Assembly, led the fight as the author of the bill to continue the incentive that we had begun and get it reenacted, which was life-saving for this program. And it was a challenging effort, as all legislative efforts are, to get this through the legislature. So I want to acknowledge the work of then Assembly Member, now Council Member Felipe Fuentes as well. So we're going to start off with a report from on the economic and production impacts of the 2009 Film and Television Production Tax Credit. There's a report by an analysis done by LAADC and SCAG, and so I'd like to ask their representatives to come forward to the front table, and we're going to have, I think, a PowerPoint presentation on this as well. So if you could come on up, please, to the front. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Councilmember O'Farrell. My name is Christine Cooper. I'm with the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon to provide an update of the findings of our most recent research, which was funded by the Southern California Association of Governments, into the actual economic impacts of the Film and Television Tax Credit Program for the first 3 years of its funding. So, we'd like to start out by thinking about this industry. We know production is very lucrative and very mobile. Cost considerations override most other factors in location decisions. So competition from other states, as we all know, is designed to induce the development of this cluster elsewhere. And, it's been successful in luring away the industry and growing other industries in other states and nations at our expense. So California still has a concentration of industry employment, and Kevin Clouden will speak to this. Currently, California accounts for about 11% of total U.S. employment, which we're a very big state. However, 41% of the industry's employment here is in California. This is it still remains a concentration of employment in the industry here. So as a result, we have a very deep and well-established industry cluster. More than 90% of the goods and services purchased by this industry are sourced from within the state. This means that the impacts of purchases, the money stays within the state. It's a very important multiplier effect. The industry spends more than $10 billion a year on goods and services in 2012, and $17 billion in employee compensation. It's a very significant contribution to economic activity in the state. So for all of these reasons, California enjoys stronger impacts from its incentive program than other states do. We have a very large economy, so most things can be purchased here. The industry itself is deep and comprehensive, so the industry has a great long supply chain. The incentives that we offer are moderate compared to other programs in other states. And we have a very progressive income tax, so for every dollar of spending, the state earns a little bit more than other states do. So we know that the initial program was enacted in 2009. It's been extended twice, so it's funded through July 2017, or June 2017. It's likely the funding will be exhausted in fiscal year 16 and probably the first day of that fiscal year, knowing the way the lottery has been performing. To date, 265 projects have received tax credit allocations of just less than $600 million. Only $133 million of that has actually been claimed and used against income tax and sales tax filings. The overall spending in California is estimated to have reached almost $5 billion out of those productions. So what now? The funding is going to be exhausted, so we're considering, there's a consideration of extending the program. Does it need to be modified? Is it worth keeping? What is the cost to the state? Does it need to be extended, expanded? So these are questions that are really being asked now. So in order to make an informed decision, we want to know what's been happening so far. So we looked at the first 3 years of funding. And the reason we looked at the first 3 years only and not all 5 years is because these projects have already been closed, completed, audited, and we know exactly what they spent. We know what they've done. We know how much they've received in tax credits. And it's a complete years of funding. So we know that they spent 3.6% more than they had originally proposed in their applications. Of course, when they apply for a tax credit allocation, that's the maximum that they can get. They can't get higher. So if they spend more at a certain point, the allocation isn't increased. They're capped at that. So this is showing just a breakdown of the types of projects and the spending credit allocations that by project type. We have feature films, independent feature films, movies of the week, television, independent movies of the week, miniseries, a variety of projects, 109 that we have accounted for, issued $235 million in tax credits. So our results are quite straightforward. 109 projects were completed. They spent almost $2 billion in California. They added together $4.3 billion in economic output. They generated 22,300 jobs in California. They paid $1.6 billion in labor income and generated $247.7 million in state and local tax revenues.
If I can just interrupt you for 1 second on those really important points. This is the direct spend of these productions. This is the total
spend. The direct spend was $1.9 billion, and it generated $4.3 billion in output after the multiplier. So the jobs, the 22,300 jobs, are total, direct, indirect, and induced.
Okay, thank you.
So one way we like to look at that is what is called an impact ratio. So for every single dollar of tax credit certificate issued, this equates to $19 in economic output, $7 in labor income, $9.5 in state GDP, and $1.11 in state and local tax revenues. Now, when we looked at these productions, we just looked at their production spending. We didn't include ancillary production, and we do know that occurs. As production occurs, there could be a commercial, a trailer. The team might decide to film something, a short documentary, a making of, all that activity because this particular project was underway here. We did not include the impacts of this additional activity. And we also did not take into account film-related tourism, which we know to be a significant driver of our economy as well. We're the home of the entertainment industry. People come to California and to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, because we have this industry. You can go to the deepest regions of the world, and they all want to know about this industry. So the impact ratio, we measure it by ROI, the state return, the state and local return to the cost. Overall, the program generated $1.11 for every tax credit dollar. However, different productions have different returns. That's a consequence of the composition of their spending and also the credit level that they receive. Some are qualifying for 20%, some qualify for 25% on their spending, qualified spending. So we just provide a range of these projects and the ROI that they actually received. What we did find, though, was that the overriding factor influencing the ROI was the percentage of spending that occurs in California that does not qualify for a tax credit. The tax credit is based on qualified spend. The rest of it comes for free. It's cost of spending. So it's the overriding factor on generating an ROI. We also found that spending often exceeds the original estimates. Like I mentioned, that the allocation is capped. The spending is not. So spending can occur, it can exceed the original estimates, and this is, again, free spending. And as I noted, there's a long delay between credit allocation and credit realization. Over almost $600 million has been allocated, only 135 have been actually used. So basically the economic activity is occurring here, the taxes are being generated on the activity that's occurring here, but the state is not paying for that activity until many years later. So another portion of our research was to look at lost opportunities. As you know, the program no longer does not cover big budget productions, any production with a budget over $75 million. Fiscal year 2013, there were 41 big budget films that were released. Only 2 of them were filmed in California. In fact, 30 of them, their entire production spending occurred outside of California. We estimate this is a loss of $4 billion in actual direct spending that occurred elsewhere, did not occur in California. This, had it occurred in California, would have produced 47,000 jobs in 1 year and $410 million in state and local taxes. So the third part of our research examined a few alternatives. We talk about a return of $1.11 for every dollar tax credit. Is it necessary to have a positive return? It is not necessary in other states. They're willing to take a loss. But it would be nice if the state got more money back than it spent, certainly. So it is a combination of production types and credit limits that will generate a positive return. And I think you can design a program that will be more likely to deliver a positive return. You can alter the credit allocation percentage. You can allow large budgets to qualify, which we test. And we consider targeted incentives to visual effects. So I wanted to touch on the large budget. There is a graph showing that the relationship between a return on investment and the qualified expenditure, the free spend, which is very important. But I wanted to touch on the large budget films because more spending means more revenue. So we did actually review some very large budgets between 150 and 250 million. And they do indeed return a higher return on investment. One of the considerations is capping the qualifying expenditures and just allowing a credit on a certain cap. And depending on where you put the cap is the question. But what we also found was that large budget films are much more likely to have large visual effects components. And you know, currently the visual effects providers are not able to qualify for a credit on their own. So it is possible that the visual effects component of large budget films will be segregated and still offshored or outsourced. And that is an additional threat to a very significant component of this industry. So I think, in conclusion, I would say the first 3 years of the funding generated better than expected returns. We had done a preliminary analysis a few years ago on the program when the projects had not been completed yet, and it turns out that the projects generated more activity and more of a return than we had anticipated. We also conclude that we have lost huge opportunities with the loss of big budget productions. That has disappeared from the state, and those jobs have gone. And we can make changes to the current program that can improve the outcomes in California and facilitate the growth and strength of the industry here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. Just a couple of questions to clarify. I hadn't actually considered this in looking at the economic reports previously, but because the allocations are based on spending estimates, predetermined spending estimates, and spending generally exceeds those estimates, your point is that the credit is actually less as a percentage of overall spending than it would have been had they stuck to the budget. Yes. Or another way to say it would be there's more spending than had been anticipated.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. Is that additional spending beyond what was budgeted included in your calculation of economic impact?
the calculation of the economic impact includes all spending.
Okay.
All
it's
spending.
It's not based just on the budgeted amount. It's the actual spend.
It's the actual spend because, as I say, we know what actually occurred. That generated activity, whether it was estimated or proposed, that generated activity. The proposed amount determines the credit allocation, and that is the only fixed element, before versus after.
Right. Now, under our program, all of the spending takes place before any of the credit gets applied.
That's right.
And it's an important point for
That's
people
right.
to understand.
Yeah.
We're not buying a pig in a poke.
That's
We
right.
have the production here, the
It's done.
spending is done, the
Yes.
people are hired, the work is done, the revenues are received, and then the credit gets applied.
The revenues are received. The tax returns are filed, so it takes a while.
Yeah. So that gap
Yeah.
between the time that the spending takes place, the economic activity is
Yes.
stimulated,
Yes.
the revenues are received,
Right.
and the time the credit is applied,
Right.
that has value to the state as
Yes,
well.
it does. Yes, it
So
does. That is
has
part
that
of the return.
Has that been calculated
Yes.
into your ROI as well?
Yes. We
Okay.
estimate a 24-month delay.
Okay. So when you compare it, for example, to the opportunity cost of other kinds of investment that the state might make with that same money,
Right.
Are you comparing apples with apples by doing that?
Well, for example,
I don't know, any other rate of return that the state might get on spending that money, in which case they'd be receiving it up front?
well, I would say tax expenditures may otherwise also occur that way for a tax credit program, because a tax credit is against activity that has occurred, and the tax returns have to be filed, so there is going to be a delay. But this is I think this is a little bit different because it's a great deal of spending, and it's not proposed, or it's not proposed, and so it's not a subject of a speculation. It's actually occurred. So I'm not sure. I'd have to look at what the different program was.
Okay. Mr. O'Farrell?
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. I have a question in relation to the jobs generated. You mentioned 22,300 jobs generated. Are those direct, production-related?
No, those are total. So
That's
it's
total,
direct
indirect,
and
indirect.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We actually don't look at the actual job numbers, the direct job numbers. I think perhaps Mr. Cotton has. But this is activity, because this, when we're looking at spending, production spending, as you know, occurs at caterers and
Right.
truckers and carpenters and laundry and a whole wide range of industries. So,
Right. So
and we don't even think of them as production jobs effectively. Those are really indirect jobs that are, their service is to sell goods and services to the production companies. So it's a very tricky industry to measure, I think.
And those indirect jobs far outnumber the direct jobs.
Yes, they do.
By a ratio of about almost 4 to 1.
I
3
defer
plus,
to your-
3 plus to 1. So, so that's this is the whole universe of employment.
That's the whole universe, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Which in itself is an important point for people to keep in mind, because I think the discussion around these credits is typically about, well, let me take a step back. Some of the criticism that has been heard, particularly in the state legislature, has been that this is a subsidy of people who work in the industry.
Yes.
And I think many who make that argument lose sight of the fact that even the people who are working in the industry because of this, who would otherwise lose their jobs with runaway production, are not famous, wealthy people. These are middle-class jobs. But as important as that is that it impacts so many people who really don't work within the industry at all,
Yes, that's
but
true.
are nonetheless dependent for their livelihood upon the spending that takes place when production occurs in California.
Right. And actually, you raise a very good point. And I think it could be because it's only in the communities that we have here that we see that happen every day, as in your community, as in Councilmember Fuentes' district. We know these jobs are related to this industry and are a threat.
In its county. It's not just Los Angeles. It's certainly not just the 13th or the 2nd or the 7th.
No,
it's countywide.
It's throughout, in Northern California as well. As I said, the visual effects industry is also under threat.
So thank you very much for this report. This is, I think it's really important to look closely at this data because when the program was initiated, we didn't have the data. We had estimates and we had guesses. But the truth is now the jury is in. The jury has come back, and yes, in fact, this program produces more tax revenues for state and local government than it costs. And I think that should be enough to resolve any doubts that some of our doubting friends in Sacramento may have about whether this incentive should be continued and in fact expanded. So it's a very important report. Thank you very much. I appreciate your being here and providing it. I also want to turn next to the Milken Institute, and Kevin Clouden is here, I think. Yes. If you could come on up and present your report. The Milken Institute did a comprehensive review of this issue as well and had some analysis and recommendations relating to what California must continue to do to remain competitive. And we look forward to hearing about that report.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for having me here as I kill my knees. What I'd like to say, first off, is that I'm very grateful to Dr. Cooper in terms of especially in terms of doing the direct analysis of the incentives, because it provides a wonderful complement explicitly to what we are doing in regards to the report that we did, and looking at jobs, and in particular also looking at what were the best practices of the states who were trying to take not only the jobs, but the overall level of the industry, both in film and television, away from California. And as I wait for the slides to come up, the most important thing that happened for us is when we did an examination, we found that two key trends were going on. First is that California has essentially been bleeding out jobs, as mentioned, since 1997. That was the year when the Canadian incentives kicked in. We actually went through a period of brief recovery around 2003, 2004. Why? Because the fact that the Canadian dollar went up, it suddenly became a lot more expensive to film in Canada. Canada hadn't adjusted yet at that point, and California benefited from a weak dollar, and suddenly things shifted back. But a couple things have really changed since then. The first is that there's been a major adjustment by our competitors, not just the Canadian provinces who introduced their own incentives, but also the other states, some of whom had introduced incentives even before that date, like New Mexico, others who ramped them up heavily, such as Louisiana and eventually Georgia and obviously New York. And in addition, the impact that incentives had became a great deal more significant. If it was just simply a matter of low cost, a state such as Nevada, which had almost no taxes, would have benefited significantly more than it actually did, especially with close proximity to California. And we found is that it really isn't just an issue of cost savings, it's really an issue of the way the incentives are constructed and how effective our competitors are at building up their local infrastructure. And in what we need to do here in making the analysis to adjust the incentives, many of, the vast majority of which the observations we made, Assemblymember Bocanegra has already incorporated into his bill, for which we are very grateful, is the fact that the states that are doing their best to compete are playing for the long haul. A lot of noise attention gets paid to states such as Michigan, where they cut their incentives back dramatically because they were far too aggressive, they couldn't afford them. States such as Iowa, which cut them entirely. a number of states which have looked at their total amount of money they have available and said, you know what, we can't play a big game. We can give you a little bit of money, and that's about it. But there are a few states that are doing something that we think is right, and that California can learn a bit from. It also shows that there is a real systemic threat. It's not just a matter of the movies went out, the TV shows went out, they can come back. It's that they're building up the local crews and building up the local facilities to keep those productions for years to come. First place that we looked at were Louisiana and New Mexico. Louisiana has become the single greatest center of motion pictures in terms of where they are filmed of any English language location. More movies are filmed in Louisiana than are filmed in California, in Georgia, in the UK. It's become the place. An observation that's been made to me is that it's not necessarily the big budget center. Big budget movies don't necessarily have the infrastructure needed in Louisiana, but it has become very profligate, and despite a period of hiccups, essentially coming out of the period after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Louisiana said, not only are we going to make this our center, but we're going to spread the wealth around. Productions in Louisiana aren't just in New Orleans. They're in Baton Rouge, they're in Shreveport, and one of the most important things Louisiana has done is realized we are going to make sure that the whole state is on board with this, not just the main center around New Orleans. New Mexico has done a really nice, consistent job of attracting movies. The interesting thing that's actually happened for them is that they have a capacity limit. When they added a couple television shows and they added a big budget movie like The Avengers, they actually ran into issues where fewer movies were filmed in 2012 because the crews in the facilities couldn't necessarily handle it. So they've recognized that they have a certain size role to play, but they're not going to be our long-term competitor. Louisiana, the real issue is that their incentives are more aggressive than California's could or should be. They're at 30% in terms of what they cover. And they also don't have a cap. There is no cap whatsoever on their incentives, so they're willing to grab anything they can, provided they can actually have the crews and the facilities to support them. If you look at it in terms of film production, California has seen a consistent downward trend in terms of the number of films that are being made here. The main reason that California has actually managed to stem this decline is and kept it at a rate that's somewhat manageable as opposed to the pure chaos that one might have expected is simply because of the fact that the incentives have done a very good job combined with the local infrastructure of keeping small to mid-budget movies in the state at a rate that is at least somewhat supportable. The catch being that, as Dr. Cooper mentioned, as has been mentioned repeatedly, big budget movies are not covered. And one of the observations that's been particularly made clear to me with different people in the industry is that not only are visual effects not covered under the current bill, although the proposed one obviously, but under the currently in existence legislation they're not covered, but there's also the fact that there is a desire on the studios to tie visual effects in the state where they're doing or location where they're doing the production. So if you're doing Avatar like James Cameron is, you're doing them down in New Zealand, you're doing the visual effects down in New Zealand, you're doing the principal photography down in New Zealand, you can, even in a digital age, you can edit all of them together. You can, since visual effects are ongoing, they're not just at the end, having them nearby is a huge advantage. The UK recognizes this and has made it a big part of their selling point. You film in the UK, you do your visual effects in the UK. Industrial Light and Magic just announced that they are adding a couple hundred jobs around London just for the sake of doing the effects in the next Star Wars movies. And they're a Northern California company. They have been traditionally a Northern California company. Their offices are half empty because everybody's out gallivanting around the globe where the work and the incentives are. It is something that needs to be emphasized when talking to Northern California because it's not just the visual effects, but all the support network for them, the entire effort that originally developed in Silicon Valley around SGI and related companies to do the rendering, to do the computing power, all of that support infrastructure was up in Silicon Valley. Mind you, the specialist role heavily down here. If they weren't up in San Francisco by ILM, a huge number were down here, but the ones that were down here are now in Vancouver or Toronto or London or Wellington, New Zealand, or somewhere else. Hour-long dramas have been particularly noteworthy in terms of their drop, largely because of the fact that the original assumption was that because the infrastructure was so much better in California, we assumed that they would have no reason to move. They wouldn't go to another state. Well, what we forgot was that hour-long dramas were the one thing that we explicitly stole from New York the most recently, in the 1950s. Originally, hour-long dramas when they were filmed live, hour-long shows, half-hour shows when they were filmed live or they were filmed and recorded, started out east. They came west because the studios actually targeted them and brought them out here. And they've shown that they are mobile. And with the development of infrastructures in other states, particularly what's happened in Georgia, but more importantly, the fact that New York already had that existing infrastructure, and because of Broadway and networks never lost it, they've been able to go after television production to a degree that no one else really has. And so if you look at it, hour-long TV shows have shown that they can move, they will move, and when we don't cover the network shows and when we don't have an allocation system in place that specifically focuses on television or accommodates when they make the decision to shoot, we put ourselves at a huge comparative disadvantage. If you look at California in terms of the competition of employment, really looking at with 2004 as the base year, what you see is the fact that since 2004, California has been drifting down. There was a brief spike of recovery coming out of the end of the writer's strike in 2009, when a number of productions which had been put on hold suddenly rushed to film here, but employment's drifted back down again. There's a brief uptick this past year in employment that wasn't captured, that came out after we did generate our report, but still that was a reflection more of the fact that overall employment in this industry is going back up again rather than any comparative gains in the behalf of California. If you look at the concentration of entertainment production, what that means is that at one, we have the same concentration of employment in entertainment production as the national average. California has consistently been the great concentration of entertainment employment. Back in 2004, we were around 3.7 times the national average. We have been slowly but surely drifting down to around 3.4, which, although still very significant, it's a lagging indicator because with the number of people who are spending their time doing their work somewhere else but are still being listed as employed here in California, that concentration is actually lower than it appears on paper. And in contrast, New York, which had been at a disadvantage for a very long time, has shifted from 1.7 up to 2.1 and is rising. New Mexico, which was a non-entity, has gone from about 0.7 up to 1.5. Louisiana has stayed a little bit lower, partly because of its population is larger than New Mexico's, and partly because of the fact that Louisiana, despite attracting a huge number of productions, has not built up the same base relative to its population as New York has. In the incentive states, the reason it's worth noting Georgia, and the reason that I think Georgia is an interesting lesson for California, is that Georgia in the 1990s, particularly Atlanta, was a rising star in entertainment, largely because of one man, Ted Turner. Georgia had become not only the center of TBS and TNT and Cartoon Network and CNN, but it had a number of facilities that were developed. A lot of employment had concentrated there. With the Time Warner merger, a lot of that moved away, and Georgia lost its momentum. And in fact, Georgia, it was interesting compared to certain other states like Florida, which had been another strong star outside of California, was in decline. Georgia has been, in many ways, the most aggressive state, not in its percentages it gives back, but in terms of financing, infrastructure, and aggressively finding a way to attract big budget movies. They give a 25% incentive, but they include above the line talent. They actually include the stars and the big directors and everybody else. you'll never ever hear me recommend that for California, don't worry. But it is a sign of the fact that Georgia is trying really hard to establish themselves in this situation. The issue with Georgia is not the type of incentives that they're doing. The issue is that when they have Pinewood come in to operate a big studio, the same way that Pinewood is hosting the next Star Wars movie in London, the fact that they attract films like The Hunger Games, the fact that they're attracting TV shows, which Louisiana hasn't really, which a number of the other states haven't. That is a sign that they are becoming really serious in terms of their infrastructure and that they are becoming another competitor. If you look at in terms of employment, and yes, I know this is hard to read, but the big number to really get out of this is that between 2004 and 2012, California lost over 16,000 jobs in the production sector. At the same time, New York, which is our greatest competitor, added over 10,000. That's not a blip. That is a significant trend. And New York, even now, is still a fraction of California's size in terms of concentrated production. And this is not total employment, mind you. This is just filmed production employment. And even given that, New York has been able to build on their infrastructure, and they are growing, and they are incredibly successful. And they combine, when you combine them with Georgia, the Canadians, and the British, pose a significant long-term threat. If you look at in terms of the share in California, one of the things that we did is we did a calculation based on the idea that entertainment employment since 2004 in the U.S. has gone down slightly, and we're talking about a competitive share within the state, within California, which comes in slightly lower than the main job losses. But the main thing we found out is that if you do a restrictive side of the direct and indirect impact of jobs, which is just production, not everything in entertainment, and even the most conservative interpretation we could generate, you're still talking about losses comparatively of over 33,000, wages lost of over $1.93 billion. And that the other thing that's in here, and I'll talk about next, is the fact that it's really about the wages. That we normalized the wages per employee in California and all the other states on 2004 numbers so that nobody would claim that inflation was distorting them. And what we found is that California is clearly pays the best wages, as it should. It has the best talent. I don't just say that, to be rah-rah about California. It has the greatest number of high specialist people who are paid more for the quality of work that they do, as you would expect of a cluster, a center that's at the leading edge of the industry. You'd expect that to be in high technology and computers up in Silicon Valley for the same reason. What we found is that New York has been catching up. It's still a bit behind, but even when you normalize them, the dollars, and now in current terms, that 81,000 is closer to 97,000. The 73,000 for New York is up to about $87,000. But the fact is that the reflection is that California's issue is not the level of wages it pays. The fact is that people will still get paid, if not that exact amount, they'll get paid a high share of them if they go to other states. They will not get paid as well as they earn if they stay here, but they will still earn a solid living. The distinction is that the states where they were cheap, supposedly, where people were only getting paid part-time, they weren't earning a living in this industry, what we found is that they're now really starting to earn a living. If you look at Louisiana, where they started out $15,000 a year for somebody in production, that means they weren't doing it as a full-time job. They're now, even normalized to $2,004 at $41,000. So that's more than doubled. It's going up considerably. In current dollars, it's well over $50,000, and it's rising. And it's going to keep rising because people in Louisiana are getting enough work that this is their full-time job. What we found in New Mexico, they went from 13 to 32,000. The states where there wasn't a shift, and in Georgia we have been seeing it, the shift has been picking up, but North Carolina, for example, which has gotten a certain amount of attention, it hasn't happened because there's not enough work in North Carolina to keep people fully employed. Our real concern is that the states where they are building up the full-fledged infrastructure, where they are developing these elements where they are targeting television, they're targeting film, they're putting the incentives in for building the studios, they're training the local talent, is at some point it is not going to be possible to even get back to 2005, let alone 2004 or 97. The fact is that international competition's here, but the distinction is that we have a limited window of the next few years where California can actually make itself not just competitive, but in a position to genuinely bring these productions back and inhibit the growth of our competitors. Right now, the competition is so strong that if you go and you try to get a soundstage in London, you can't. They're full. If you want to go to Georgia, they're running at a very high level. If you go to Louisiana, they have support and capacity issues. That's a sign that not only are the productions going other places, but they're going to the places that can support them. It's not just a blip. It's not just, hey, we're going to follow the money. We have a limited opportunity. We have an opportunity with the new legislation. We have an opportunity in terms of what the city can do to make itself better able to facilitate local productions and be more friendly, and to look at our cost structure and compare them to what New York did and figure out what are the things that we can do to make California more competitive and LA more competitive, because we have a huge advantage. The talent is still here. The infrastructure is still here. And the fact is the people who make the decisions would rather keep the productions closer to home, not just for money, but because, quite honestly, they can do their job better and they don't have to spend all their time on the road. So, thank you.
For the time being.
Yeah.
But I think part of the point of showing this escalation in the wages received in other incentive states is that those states are now able to develop their own human capital. There's going to be greater depth of crews in some of these states, which is going to increase their capacity to take on more production. The talent that we have here, and I always hear from people in the industry that despite incentives elsewhere, California remains, to the extent that California remains a preferred location, it's because we have the best crews, the best talent, the best vendor community and all that anywhere on earth. But as the wages go up in other places, some portion of that talent, some portion of those crews that we have locally are going to relocate to those other places so that they can work. It becomes a snowball effect that is going to increase their capacity at the same time that we lose our greatest competitive advantage.
Yes, and it's not just the crews. It's, as you mentioned, the vendors. Vendors are opening up branches or relocating to where they think there's less competition and more work. So they might go to Georgia because they know that they can get the steady work. New York's already well positioned in that regard because when in doubt, they've been able to draw on the Broadway people and the off-Broadway people, let alone some of the others. They know that the concentration is there. And vendors will go where there's work. And, if you have a vendor, even if it's a specialized dry cleaner, for example, who suddenly finds that, the old NBC facilities in Burbank are empty, if they want to adapt, they've got to move. And if they think they have got great services and they could sell them to somebody in Georgia, they might open up an operation there.
Thank you. Mr. O'Farrell?
Thank you. Plus, there's the humiliation of entertainment professionals in Los Angeles who went to those states and trained all of these people to continue cultivating jobs and encouraging and adding to the runaway production crises that we're facing. It's a great report. Thank you very much. And this might be an off-the-wall kind of question, but I've heard that in China they're building massive sound stages and developing amenities in China that will just put to shame anything that's under construction in the United States anywhere. So is that something, it might be a bit abstract now, but in the coming years, might that be a profound concern to all of us?
Well, it's going to be a concern. The fact is that there's still the language barrier, there's still the talent barrier, there's still going to be a limitation. You're going to take a risk when you initially go there. But all it takes is a series of productions over an extended period, going there and saying, we will save enough money that we think it's worth taking the risk, even if we have to do reshoots, even if we have to have a backup plan. It just takes just enough productions to do that, to raise up the local talent level. I think that there is going to be an inherent limit. There is a reason why productions have tended to stay in English-speaking zones, and that is, it's not just quality of individuals. It's the language barrier is significant. The amount of control one has is significant. If you're in China, you do run intellectual property issues that you'll have to worry about, and I think that will be a hindrance. But that being said, a number of productions may decide that it's worth it regardless. They'll take the risk, and it'll be up to the Chinese to manage doing the IP protections and doing the other quality control protections to make it worthwhile. But Malaysia, for example, invested in a bunch of soundstage space with the idea of luring productions in. And the fact is the Chinese don't just need to cater to us. If they could get the Indians in, if they could get the filming industry in Hong Kong in, or if the Japanese in, or the Koreans, if the Koreans decide they're going to start filming their period soap opera dramas, which are one of their greatest exports, they decide it's cheaper to move it to China than they're gutting the Korean industry and moving it there. It's a global competition. They don't just need us.
Thank you.
Given the global nature of this industry now, and for that matter, most industries, we're a globalized world now. But given that globalization, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the argument that is often made that government should just get out of the business of incentivization in this industry. It's an unfair trade practice. We should just prohibit any incentives in the United States and then pursue those other countries who offer them for having pursued unfair trade practices. Is it possible to put the genie back in the bottle? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, no, I wish it were, to be honest, because then we'd have the huge comparative advantages to our benefit to put it back in the bottle. The problem is that the only way you're going to block incentives at the state level is to go to Congress. And can you honestly imagine the current Congress making a decision that they're going to pass laws interfering the state's ability to lure businesses?
Especially when it benefits California?
Oh, yeah, especially when it benefits California, because, forgive me, but it's going to wind up being a red state, blue state argument. And the fact is that if it's film, why can't you stop it with various other industries as well? What's to stop Texas from targeting high tech and aerospace? You can imagine how well that's going to go over with the Texas delegation, let alone anybody else. It's hard. I'm all in favor of the idea that if we're an even playing field, but you can't just do that. And the fact is that the states that don't manage their incentives well will fall out of the race. They will either look at it, it's going to hit some sort of political decision. New Mexico, which I think has done a very nice job, they went in, the governor, Susana Martinez, came and looked at it, and she created a limit on the production, on the program. She didn't get rid of it, she just said, we can only handle so much. I think there'll be more assessments like that. I think that there'll be more cases where states will realize we can only have so much capacity, we can only put so much money into it. But if you still have New York, if you still have Louisiana, you still have Georgia, that threat is still there, and I don't think it's going away. Do I think that you could go after the Canadians for their incredibly high level of incentives on visual effects and whether or not it's actually paying for itself? That's something that could be approached, but that's a very specific issue. And I think even there in Canada, politically, if British Columbia is offering too much money, there is going to be pushback, and there has been pushback. It's just a question of how it shakes out.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your report. Thank you very much for your important input. We were passing around earlier a clipboard with a sign-in sheet. The purpose of that is so that we can keep all of you informed about future hearings of this committee and otherwise communicate with you. So if you haven't already signed that, we'll pass it around again. Mayor and Anna, if you could just bring it back for anybody who might have been missed. With that, and then we'll be taking public comment right after the next section. But now I'd like to, in fact, I'm honored to be able to invite up a great assembly member for the San Fernando Valley, Assembly Member Raul Bocanegra, who is, along with his colleague, Assembly Member Mike Gatto, the author of AB 1839, the next step forward for California in protecting film and television production jobs. And Assemblyman, it's a great pleasure to recognize your important work and welcome you to Los Angeles City Council.
Thank you, Councilman Krikorian. I used to call you Assemblymember Krikorian not too long ago. It's the pleasure is mine. No secret that I started my career in public service in this great building, and it just brings back memories to be in this chamber. Saw fantastic public servants like John Ferraro, Rita Walters, Alex Padilla, Marvin Browdy, Hal Burnson. I can go on and on and on, and it's my pleasure, and I am here today very fortunate and thinking about those days more and more. But I can't top the two presenters who just talked right now in terms of sharing their reports, because I think that they do a really good job of cutting to the brass tacks and sharing the numbers and the impact that this industry has to the state of California. But and while we've heard about all the great things that the program tried to do and has done, I think what we try to do, myself and Mr. Gatto and the many co-authors that we have on this bill, is to improve and expand the program. If we're truly going to be competitive with some of the other states that were mentioned in the previous speakers' slides, we're going to have to really get aggressive about how we go about doing business and how we go about taking care of a very important industry that is our signature industry here in California. And while we talked a little bit about also how we got here, I think I like to go over it a little bit about your work on this. I think it's very easy for us to forget 2009. Seems like a long time ago, but there were a lot of questions. There was a lot of late night negotiating, and there was a big deficit that had to be overcome. And our comments earlier today between you and I, you said that sometimes that was a good talking point in terms of an economic stimulus. But we clearly wouldn't be where we're at without your work and the subsequent work of my predecessor and good friend Felipe Fuentes for extending the program for another 3 years for $300 million. And it was something that was very difficult, but we're here today. I know there's a lot of people in this room who've been hurt by the flight of production to other states, and I can't tell you over the last couple of weeks especially the stories I've heard from my constituents back in the 39th District who've had to cut, who, if they didn't lose their job because of the production leaving the state, they had to spend some part of their year away from their families by having to travel to Louisiana or Georgia. And I understand that the industry, though, needs the certainty that comes with Sacramento's long-term commitment to the state's successful incentive program. New York would never let their signature industry just walk away, and we shouldn't either with our industry, the entertainment industry. And while you've heard some better numbers than the ones I'll share with you today, I just like to put them in perspective and just to drill down. I think the facts speak for themselves. In 2013, only one network show, 1-hour drama, was filmed here in California out of the 23 new shows last year. And so getting the new 2-year extension passed and signed by the governor in 2012 was a crucial step, but as all of you know, the fight is really just beginning. And I'd like to share with you that I'm not alone, not just with my joint author, Mr. Gatto, but we have a significant amount of supporters north and south, inside the Los Angeles delegation and outside of this great area, who are ready to work and to make sure that this is something where we share with our friends that this is something that we remain committed to and growing this very crucial industry. Since our incentive program launched that you helped author, Mr. Krikorian, in 2009, the state has allocated tax credits to nearly 275 film and TV projects. By the time these projects have completed post-production, they will have spent something like $4.7 or over $4 billion in the state. This includes nearly $1.5 billion in wages paid to tens of thousands below-the-line workers. And while I didn't graduate in a finance degree from UCLA, I think that's a pretty good rate of return. And the rate of investment of $1.11 for every dollar out, I think, is a good indicator that this is a program that more than just pays for itself. The program has allowed us to level the playing field, which means we've been able to retain many productions that otherwise would have fled our state. It's simply common sense that when our state hosts more production, we get more jobs, more tax revenue, two things that our state still dearly needs. But it's going to take all of us working together to make this done. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think are some of the political challenges that we have in Sacramento in the next couple of months. But let me just go give you an overview of what's in the bill currently, and we can talk a little bit about that. First and foremost, we're going to extend the program an additional 5 years. And that's consistent with tax code policy that comes out of revenue and taxation in the Assembly, and I chair that committee, and 5 years is a good, I think, time for us to try to extend the program. Next, we're trying to lift the cap, as some of the speakers have talked about, on films that are able to apply for the program. A film of any size now will be able to apply to the program. However, as was stated, only qualified expenditures of up to $100 million will be able to take advantage of the credit. As you've heard in the LEDC report, if the Bill 1839 was in place, those 30 big budget feature films filmed in the state last year alone would have created something like 50,000 jobs, or I think that the $4 billion number is what I saw in the PowerPoint, and a tax revenue something of $410 million. So we're going to also allow, third, the one-hour TV series, regardless of where they air, whether it's on cable, broadcast, or Netflix, to be able to apply for the program. In the past, and currently in the program, that's not the case right now, but considering all the jobs that are created and the ability or the possibility of getting a series done in California that can have a long tenure, whether it's 5 years or as long as Law and Order or Gunsmoke, for those of us who remember Gunsmoke, that just means more jobs. And in concert with some of our co-authors throughout the state, the bill reflects a incentive for a 5% increase bump of filming outside of the LA area zone. And that's to reflect some of the other beautiful states, all the other beautiful parts of the state where filming takes place already. Of note is my co-author, Mr. Rob Bonter from Alameda County, and the filming that takes place in his district. He has stories after stories of filming done in Jack London Square. Finally, we're also going to offer a 25% credit for TV shows relocating to the state. For the comments that were mentioned by the Milken Institute, those are the types of series that we want back in California, and also to be competitive with all the other states. But there are also other components, but those were the key 5 or 6 points to the program. Nowhere in the talking points did I talk about the dollar value of what we're trying to do, and that's being strategic. But believe it or not, while the state is doing much better than it did back in 2009, Councilman, when you did the first program, I think that it behooves us to be strategic in rolling out this and to basically show a lot of momentum that we have throughout the entire state, not just in Southern California. And the legislative process, as you should recall, Mr. Krikorian, it's a long and lengthy one. This particular bill will make 3 policy stops before the Assembly floor. So we didn't want to have to defend a number that wasn't based on real numbers, and we're waiting for the May revision to try to have that dialogue and discourse. But I will tell you, and the CLA made a good point of reminding me that in order for us to be competitive, we're going to have to be in the same ballpark as some of these other states, like New York, for example. So it's not lost on me that in order for us to bring back and to keep some of these jobs in this great state of ours, we're going to have to be in that ballpark range of the $400+ million like other states are. And also something that we had to take in terms of previous extensions of the bill, we just can't settle for a 1-year extension. That 5-year extension is something I think is important. It brings a certainty, and we're going to do all that we can to make sure and to explain why the 5-year sunset, I think, would be a good part to have in this bill. And I'll share with you that we're off to a good start. The bill has something like, out of the 120 members of the state legislature, not just in the Assembly, but in the state Senate, we have 2/3 of them either being a principal co-author, or a joint author on this bill. So nowhere have we heard from folks that they think this isn't a program that merits the discussion and the debate to have a much more robust and improved program. All is good, I can tell you from that front, to report from Sacramento. I think it's important to recognize the city council's effort, the effort of the city council, and that also of our mayor, Mayor Garcetti, in crafting this legislation. His team have provided a lot of information, and they've engaged in us both in working with us on the policy of the bill and helping, quite frankly, to convince some of our colleagues to join as co-authors on this bill. So I'd like to give a special note to our mayor and to the efforts of the city council. But I don't want to mislead you here. This is going to be a heavy lift because there are still some corners of the legislature who think that this is somehow a subsidy for a famous director here or an actor there. And I think what really going to have an impact is telling the stories. Some of the stories that we've heard, quite frankly, at a rally in Burbank about 2 or 3 weeks ago that are going to move the needle on this and to really drive home the impact that we just can't settle for a one-year extension or having an annual program funding at the same amount. This has got to be bigger. This has got to be larger. Because when you have a bigger funding, you also can able to attract those big tentpole films and productions, and that means more jobs, which means more taxes, which means it's money back into the general fund, paying for things that this state really needs to pay for. Going back to the story, and quite frankly, Councilman O'Farrell, I have to. I think I'm going to take your comment about this really being a jobs bill, and this has to be part of our lexicon back in Sacramento. This is really not just an economic stimulus bill. This is a jobs bill, and in order for us to drive home the idea that this is a jobs bill, we have to go back to this idea of stories. Stories like the ones that I have all the time in my district. In Salentahunga, as you recall, Councilman, you got folks like PRG and Pascal Lighting, which employ hundreds of people. Dozens of our constituents, whether they're in the 7th, the 9th, the 2nd, I should say the 6th, who make a good wage. And a lot of these jobs are union jobs as well in this industry. But I want to talk about one in particular, and perhaps you'll hear about it a little bit later in public testimony, and that's of a company in the community of Van Nuys in CD6, Chef Robert Catering, as I'm sure some of you folks know. And this is a catering company that started 15 years ago with a single truck. And now Chef Robert and the company run one of the largest catering companies for productions in the country. Unfortunately for us, though, he set up branches in Louisiana and Georgia and New Mexico because there's so much filming in those states. You saw the data that the Milken Institute provided. He has to be competitive. That's where the filming is done. So a new infrastructure is taking place in those states. And sometimes we have folks from California teaching new people and creating a new workforce in those states how to take over their jobs. Well, I think that we have enough stories like that to really drill down at the fact that we need to be competitive and we just can't be doing what we've been doing. So that's a great story in terms of Chef Robert and Van Nuys. We also heard this past weekend of Southland Lumber, just outside of CD9, that had to close because they can't remain competitive because all the filming that's left outside of California. And they just closed their business after 70 years of being in operation. And there's story after story after stories like that we need to share, not just in the Assembly, but also in the State Senate. And then I think once we're primed and ready to take this to the governor's office to remind everybody in Sacramento that this is a jobs bill, that these are working class jobs, these are good paying jobs. And I think you've heard me say this before, where there used to be a time in this great state of ours, especially in this beautiful city, where we used to create things like cars, faucets, right? We don't do that anymore. For all intents and purposes, this is still a manufacturing industry that we still have in California. We need to keep it here. Rome is burning, and we just can't, do nothing while it burns. We need to really have a strategic plan to keep these industries, here. We also have to remind folks that this is an industry that in many ways started here, and we need to keep it here. And I'll close by saying this, because I'm kind of a movie buff, and this will be the 75th year of Hollywood's greatest year, or their era, where they had things like Gunga Din made from the studios, and Gone with the Wind, and one of my favorite Frank Capra movies, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And, well, I don't think of myself as Mr. Smith. I think that the point and the moral of that movie was that, that the good guys and the good policies can triumph over all the obstacles. And we do have a lot of obstacles, but with any luck and with everybody here working together, we can get it done. And what a better present to give to this industry than a 5-year program, a vastly more improved and robust program. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, take any suggestions, but this is really a partnership. And I thank you so much, not just for your interest, but for your stewardship on this issue.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here today, and thank you for your leadership and strong advocacy on this issue. I couldn't agree with you more about the need to tell stories, because it just, for some reason, all the economic analysis in the world kind of rolls off people's backs, and they don't seem to grasp it in Sacramento until you tell that story about somebody you met, somebody whose life has been negatively impacted, somebody who couldn't be at home for that important anniversary or that birthday, or couldn't see their child graduating because they were in Atlanta or someplace. When you tell those stories, I think it is very often impactful on our friends in public service. When I was at North Hollywood Props to see one of the greatest collection of movie props ever assembled, ready to be auctioned off because they were closing their doors, that's an irrevocable harm to this industry. That you can't ever get something like that back. But I think very often it's the stories that even have nothing to do with the industry that people need to hear. And I think when I first became most aware of this as being a direct jobs issue that affects middle-class people and working-class people, was when I was walking precincts back in 1999 on this. And I ran into a woman who was talking to her about this. She said she'd been adversely impacted by it, and I assumed she must have something to do with the industry. I said, well, what's your line of work? She said she was a housekeeper. And she had lost clients because those clients were in turn dependent upon this industry, and because they weren't working as much, they weren't hiring the housekeeper, they weren't going to the local restaurant, they weren't going to the movies, well, they weren't going to the bowling alley, they weren't going and doing all the other things that people do when they spend the money that they earn, and that affects everybody across the spectrum of our economy. So I would like you to just define, if you can. I'm so pleased to hear how many people you have signed on to this bill. It's a really good indication of momentum. It's bipartisan, all across the state. It's terrific. What do you see as being the biggest challenges you're going to face going forward, and what can the eager people who are in this room and who will be watching this on the screen, what can they do to help you to get across the goal line? What's the call to action, if you will?
Yes, right. Thank you. That's a great question. I'm not going to take anything for granted. The first hearing will be next Tuesday in the Arts and Entertainment Committee that Mr. Ian Calderon chairs. And we've got a couple of co-authors on who serve on that panel, including Assemblymember Bloom from Santa Monica. So I believe that that's going to be the first test, the ability for us to turn out folks who can tell the stories, who can share with them. And you're right, for whatever reason, that data gets lost on folks, and we can really respond to the stories of jobs lost, jobs gained. Those are the stories that we're really going to need. If you can't make it to Sacramento, having something faxed in terms of a letter or emails, that's important. Calling the members of the committee who serve on arts and entertainment will also be helpful, just so that folks can hear loud and clear that after we leave arts and entertainment, if we're lucky, we're going to have a lot of momentum to going into the Committee of Revenue and Taxation, which I chair. But and I feel pretty good about that.
You like your chances
I
there?
like my chances there, quite frankly, Councilman. But we can't take it for granted like we've taken this industry for granted. Now, I'll be honest with you. We're going to need everybody's call to action once this bill gets into the Senate. And that's all I'll say about that.
Well, I'll say a little bit more about that.
There you go, because
there have been, as I said at the outset, there have been 7 or 8 assembly bills introduced and passed through the assembly dealing with grants, loans and tax credits over the years to help this industry. And until 2009, every single one of those died in the state Senate because the Senate has been led by Northern Californian Democrats who, for some reason, could not see the jobs benefit and the economic development impact of this on working and middle-class people. And it's been a great source of frustration that we always seem to crash on the shores of Northern California. So I think it will be imperative for those of you who have friends in Northern California, those of you who do business with companies that are in Northern California, particularly around the Bay Area and Sacramento area, it's important to engage them in this as well. And I'm pleased to hear that you have Northern California co-authors. But this example of Industrial Light and Magic, here's a major employer in the Bay Area, major employer that is losing its jobs to London. And, you couldn't have a better example of that as to why this is a statewide issue. It's not a Los Angeles issue. It is a statewide issue, and people up north should be seeing it that way as well.
And Mr. Chair, if you don't mind a quick
Sure.
observation, you're right. You and I had a conversation prior to the hearing that the mood is a lot different. The grassroots is much different in terms of trying to organize a united front to expand this program and to extend it. What's also changed is the state's economic outlook. When you did the bill in 2009, I think over that 18-month period, you had to cut $40 billion from the state's budget. Even when Mr. Fuentes carried the extensions, we had a $20 billion budget gap during 1 year. Well, we're not in that same boat anymore. It's a much more improved outlook, and I think that the numbers speak for themselves. By us engaging in something that's more robust, that's more improved, we can in fact bring in more tax revenue into this state. So that the fact whether we have a $4 billion surplus or $7 billion surplus, no matter which department you talk to or the LAO, we'll know what the fiscal outlook will look like when we get the May revision in terms of the budget. But so far the forecast looks pretty good. So we're going to operate from a much different stance than we did back in 2009.
And the data is there now.
Right.
The evidence is in.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, they're really arguing against the facts if they don't see that. Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Assemblymember Bocanegra, there is nothing that you said that I did not love hearing. So thank you. It's very encouraging. And you answered almost all of the questions that I had. I was just checking them off as you were going along. So I really applaud and thank you for your thorough presentation and all your incredible work on this Assembly bill. I would love to know and before I ask the question, I'm a huge film buff myself. Just one of the things that attracted me to move to Los Angeles at 21. And I know where one of the costume trunks from Gone with the Wind is, somewhere in the 13th District, and I can show you where that is.
I'm going to take you up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of the New York system is more or less a first come, first serve, and we have more of a lottery system in California.
Right.
What are your thoughts in relation to those arrangements?
Right. Well, the lottery system, I don't want to speak for a whole lot of folks except for myself. I'm not a big fan of it. I think there's a lot of folks who aren't a fan of the lottery system. There's some folks here from the Film Commission who might speak more to that.
Actually,
but
Amy
I will
Lemmish
say,
is here. If I could ask Amy, is she still here? Is Amy Lemmish still here?
But I will say that we give the authority to the Film Commission to come up with a different program.
Sorry, you missed the question.
Yes. So New York has more or less a first come, first serve system, as opposed to California has a lottery system for the qualifications. And I would just like to know your thoughts on that.
Ours is actually first come, first served as well.
Okay.
We, in anticipation of the large volume of applications that we get on the first day of each fiscal year, we needed a method to address that first come, first served. So we implement a random selection or lottery on that first day. The difference is that they have enough funding so that there isn't a rush on the first day. It balances out where production just apply when they are ready to begin shooting and they are processed in an orderly fashion. We would love to be able to handle it that way, but because there's such a finite amount of funding and such high demand, we get that big rush at the beginning of the fiscal year. That's the difference.
I am so glad I asked that question. That was very illuminating. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
In the first year, we front-loaded the first 2 years of funding into 1 year just to accommodate the surge of applications. And now, how many minutes does it take after it's open before the entire year is subscribed?
It's basically in an hour where we've allocated everything we have for that whole fiscal year.
So it's like the system, it probably practically crashes every time you know. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Councilman, I think what I will say is that on a going forward basis with AB 1839, we're silent on that. We give that authority to the Film Commission. But I think what we heard inherently in our comments, if we have a bigger program, we can have a much better system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's our goal here, is to have a much larger, robust funding program.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Assemblymember, very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Ms. Lemish. We now will go to public comment, and we'll set this for 2 minutes per speaker, and our first speaker will be Daniel Lay, followed by Ted Burge. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm Daniel Lay, and I represent adaptvfx.org. You can visit our website to check out what we're up to. Just want to thank you for speaking today about visual effects industry, because we're a big player in California here, and there's been a massive loss here. Just wanted to speak about some of the problems that we're having. Obviously, I mentioned this last time, is that obviously we're here today to discuss about the expansion of the program here. In order to compete, you could double this program and you would still not see an effect, because in British Columbia, they will pay 60% of our wages, okay? I've contacted the British Columbia government twice. They've been able to verify this. I have the emails. I can show you that. That being said, in order to have a plan of attack here, we have to have a comprehensive program here. Obviously, one side is, yes, go ahead and give out more subsidies, obviously increase the program. That's, some people have been saying that. But also our effort has been dedicated, as you mentioned, some trade routes here. Any industry that's being injured by these subsidies allow for domestic industries to go to the federal government and essentially get relief in the forms of duties that will be placed on those international subsidies. Okay. Now, we could arrive at a decision by 2015. I think this law, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't even go into effect until 2016, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. But we wanted to speak about that, and we have a few VFX artists here who would like to speak about that, even some who've come down from Vancouver. That being said, I have, let's say, 30 seconds left here. The path to victory for this bill obviously has to go through the legislature, and Jerry Brown, he's expressed some skepticism about supporting film subsidies. Our barrier for entry for this effort, this legal effort, it's not going to cost millions of dollars. The LA City Council can support us unilaterally and help us out with this. So I just wanted to see if they'd be interested in that.
With regard to the trade efforts or this bill?
This trade effort, which can go forward as an amendment, but the LA City Council can unilaterally help us. The council members here can also help. So we could see a potential rectification of this issue in 2015 if we wanted to. So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Ted Burge, followed by Daryl Sparky Herzon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Ted Burge. I've been working in the visual effects industry and feature animation for a long time, and I'm here as an individual because I'm interested in seeing that you succeed with your efforts in finding a solution for the problems that we're having here in LA. I have many friends that are being told that their jobs are going to be moving up to Vancouver, and as a part of the success of that, I would like to, or I would hope that you would have a multi-pronged solution, which would include such things as also incentives for being able to start startup companies in the area and to maximize keeping the money into the local economy as well. There is a structure that you can put into place for bylaws for a corporation that allow the employees and the leadership of a company to align more in their viewpoints of how the company works, and it has beneficial side effects to the local community. The name that you would be looking for would be a worker self-directed enterprise, and there's testimony in front of the New York City Council regarding that. A professor from Yale has listed a set of benefits that line up very well with the visual effects community. Some of that would include a worker self-directed enterprise has better engagement with creativity and commitment and quality and intensity of the workers than a traditional enterprise, which gives it a strategic advantage. It better engages communities because they are more locally based and locally focused compared to a conventional enterprise. And the decisions about the technologies they use, and this is for other things in other industries, and their environmental impacts respects their surrounding communities much more than conventional enterprises. And as a thing that I think everyone in the visual effects community is very sensitive about would be a self-directed enterprise would be rarely relocates production sites away from the communities, making such enterprises' jobs much more secure. So if there are a variety of solutions in which to incentivize creating such organizations.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, the next speaker is Daryl Sparky Herzon, followed by Eric Rosenthal. Good afternoon.
Sir, you've seen my face before.
Yes, we have.
I'm doing the best I can. You're talking about crews leaving, best trained crews. Well, I am one of the best trained crews. I've been around for a long time. Just recently I had a call to go to Georgia to do a feature film, and I turned it down because I will not leave LA. I have a son here who's working over at Paramount Studios. He got a call to go to Georgia. I won't let him go. So I'm taking funds out of my own savings over my career to help him. I'm preaching to the choir here, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to have seen, from a native Californian, all of our industry leave. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you gentlemen don't stand up and fight, it's going to be over. And the more people that are coming to California, there's not enough jobs. And the other thing, too, is the death of Sarah Jones. And this is going to cause a problem with OSHA, because over the United States now, this has opened up their eyes to safety and training. As a lighting technician, we have the finest training program in the world, and it's right here. And we're traveling out to Louisiana, and these folks are not trained to do set lighting. We're the only ones. And as we go, these people are learning our jobs. So we need to do it. We need to have an $800 million tax incentive. On an interview I saw last week, one of the major producers from Fox said, I got to get the best bang for my buck. We'd love to stay here, but we're not getting the best bang for our buck, so we have to leave. So I'm here, I'm a face, and I'll be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker is Eric Rosenthal, followed by Robert DeStefan.
Hi. Thank you for letting me speak. I'm a visual effects artist from Los Angeles, and I knew, like all artistic fields, visual effects is not a stable career, and we've known that other countries, would have cost advantages with cheaper labor. But it turns out that countries like Canada, New Zealand, England, and Australia have used their taxpayer-funded subsidies to build their own visual effects industries that has decimated the Los Angeles industry. And most visual effects companies in LA have closed up their offices while opening up their offices in the subsidized countries. Film subsidies don't help the VFX workers. To continue to work in our industry, we have to become nomads and travel from country to country chasing work. And they don't really build permanent industries either. When the subsidies go away, the film productions can easily move to another subsidized location, and they can threaten to pull work from locations unless they increase the subsidy percentage. The only long-term benefits of subsidies go to movie studios, and they can pit countries and states against each other in a race to the bottom. New Zealand offers a 15% subsidy, England offers 20%, Canada offers 25%. where does it end? And we don't believe California can win this race, or any other state or country can. It's just a race to the bottom. And meanwhile, movie studios continue to make record profits and collect taxpayer money as a bonus. We don't feel that Los Angeles is entitled to visual effects work just because the movie studios are based here. We just want to level a playing field so the companies here have an equal opportunity. And we're working on a legal effort to challenge the subsidies. And if it's successful, we believe it'll allow the visual effects industry in LA to survive. And it's a tiny fraction of the cost of the subsidies. And we just want our success or failure of our industry to be based on the merits of the companies, not the location. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Robert DeStefan, followed by Sarah Walsh.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm a makeup artist with Local 706. I've been fortunate enough to work my butt off, get out of effect shops, and go to work on set. Since that time, within the past year, I've had 30 days of working on set. That time, 19 of those days are thanks to projects that were brought about by the incentive program. So I would not have had that work if it wasn't for the state incentive. The best I can offer is please keep it going. Raise it as much as necessary. I love the business that I'm in. I love living in Los Angeles. I'm originally from New York. If I wanted to work there, I would have stayed there. I've been fortunate enough to meet my wife in this business and to have my stepkids raised in this business. I would really like to see it continue here. Like Sparky, I've been offered to go to Georgia. I've turned it down. I want my tax dollars going to the state I live in, the work benefiting all the businesses in my community, and I would really like to see this continue. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Sarah Walsh, followed by Kent Matsuoka.
Hi, good afternoon, Councilman.
Hello.
Sarah Walsh from the Motion Picture Association of America. I just wanted to thank the committee for your work on this issue and for highlighting the findings of the two studies we heard about today. I think they confirm what we've always believed to be the case, which is that the production tax credit creates jobs, it's a boost to the state's economy, and it's a good deal for the taxpayers in this state. And so I just wanted to tell you that we appreciate your continued support for our industry and your support for Assemblymember Bocanegra's bill, and thank you again for holding the hearing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And if anybody else would like to speak, please fill out one of these cards and bring it forward. Our next speaker is Kent Matsuoka, followed by Ed Gutentag. Is Kent still here? Okay. Then Ed will be next, followed by Joe Guerra.
Do I get their extra time that they didn't use? Oh, okay. All right, this will prepare.
But we're flexible. We're flexible.
Okay, this will prepare me for my Oscar speech.
We don't have music that swells.
Good. So I'm Ed Gutentag. I'm still moving, and I wanted to tell you a story because you guys like stories, and you might say, what does it have to do with anything? So somebody mentioned Sarah Jones. So Sarah Jones, for those that don't know, was a camera assistant that was killed on the 20th of February, and I was affected by it greatly, like a lot of filmmakers. And I saw a post on Facebook that said, why can't we get her name mentioned in the Oscars? So I picked up the phone and I called my friend Hawk Koch, who was the outgoing president of the Academy. And he said, geez, I don't think we can make that happen. And I said, well, what do you mean? They're going to put Harold Ramis's picture up there, and he didn't know Harold Ramis died. So I'll try and condense this. So there was a petition that went around. There was many phone calls. There was emails that went back and forth to the Academy. I ended up talking to a friend of mine that was actually on the In Memoriam committee. And you were talking about an agency that's more political than politics, I think. You know, the Academy, the Motion Picture Academy. There's a lot of politics that goes on there. So to make a long story short, I don't know if you know, but at the end of Bette Midler's song, they ended up putting her name there. So my point is that everybody thinks that this is impossible. I mean, you got it done in 2009, and now, Assemblyman Bocanegra is working on it. It's not impossible. It can be done. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but this state has the best chance of not losing money with the incentive because of all the things we've had in place for all these years. Thank you.
Thank you. And not only is your story a good example, but they're also very much related because as production goes all over the places, that was in Georgia. And, if they don't have the same kind of safety standards we have, if they don't have the same kind of depth of crew and expertise that we have here, there are going to be more injuries and more tragedies like this that are more likely to occur when you shoot outside of California than you shoot when you have the resources and the crews that we have here. So thank you for doing that, Ed. Next speaker is Joe Guerra, followed by Ricardo Zenithini.
Good afternoon. I'm Joe Guerra, and I'm here representing Entertainment Finance LLC. We're a finance company in Century City. And our company for the past 5 years, including my partner Kim Holland, a Chinese-American ambassador, and myself, have been speakers and are now overseeing the annual Chinese-American Business Summit Entertainment Forum on April 28th, and speaking directly to hundreds of Chinese investors. And we hope to direct their investments in local productions to support the Runaway Productions effort. Our company is currently representing a consortium of international and domestic investors with final stage funding for feature films with budgets under $25 million. As a California-based company, we are, of course, inclined to direct our funds to investments that are made locally. However, it is our fiduciary responsibility to our investors and investment partners to encourage spending that would yield the highest return on our investments. It's in this effort that I've attended today with my partners. It's our sincere hope that Los Angeles will create a more enticing proposal to investors to build local economic development. It's our suggestion that building a strategic relationship with local banks and film distribution houses to encourage them to favor films made locally by including participants in the upcoming publicity and press associated with the marketing campaign for Saving Runaway Productions. We feel that a strong local alliance will create a local drive, both from the public as well as the financial institutions that support films here, encouraging international pre-sales and California-based A-list acting talent, which drives the investments and the pre-sales from distribution. Thank you for letting me speak today.
Right. Thank you very much. And it's another good reminder as we have more support for the incentive program, we're going to make the return on investment for investors more likely as well, so which is what drives this industry forward. Our next speaker is Ricardo Zenithini, followed by Tom Davis. And again, anybody else who'd like to speak, please fill out a card and bring it forward.
So thank you very much for the opportunity today, and thank you for not distorting my first and last name. So my name is Ricardo Zenithini, of course, and I'm the VFX artist, lead supervisor. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I worked on several movies that everybody's seen, from Star Wars to The Hobbit. And most of the time I worked out of here in LA. Originally I came from Italy a long time ago, became a citizen here. I'm very proud to be here in the United States. Right now I'm working out of Vancouver, where I had to move last October. And that, of course, as everybody knows, is because of the tax breaks. Most of the visual effects work has been moved to Canada, between Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. My family is still here, so I see them once a month. And tax incentives are so high in Canada that it's making it work for the studios to be there. Interesting thing is the company I work for has an office here in LA as well, which is mostly empty, and it's 10 minutes from my home. But I cannot work there because, of course, I'm not valuable here, since my presence in Canada makes me valuable, because it's not only my work that makes me valuable, of course, but also my location. The technology that the companies develop to be able to work abroad, most of the companies are from California anyway. It's based on a concept that everybody is remotely logged in to computers here in LA. So the computers stay in California, but we're not. We have to move around the world. This system is also made so that they can quickly move somewhere else, to another country, which, funny enough, could be the studios in China that you mentioned before, because it's only a matter of a few days to actually move this technology around the world. This same technology would actually allow me to work from home if I wanted to, because I only need a very good internet connection, and I could literally be anywhere I wanted. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker is Tom Davis, followed by Ken Haber. Mr. Davis, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. First off, I want to start by saying thank you for your leadership so many years ago. We worked closely trying to get something going so that we wouldn't be at the stage that we are. But unfortunately, as you talked about earlier, we are where we're at. And I also want to thank Assemblyman Bocanegra for taking this by the horns and packaging something that I think is going to make a difference. My comments really are more about what we're facing today. And, we can talk about the numbers, and the economists, they can crunch the numbers all day long. And it's wonderful that our program actually gives a return to the taxpayer. And I think that that's something that we have to talk about and sort of spread the word on. We can talk about the theoreticals of international trade and tariffs and all that, and that's all well and fine, but that's already been settled a number of years ago for some of us who were around back then when there was an effort to take it to the WTO. But what I'm really most concerned about, and all I really care about, quite frankly, are the jobs. Within the groups that we represent, we've seen over 1,600 people not just go work in other states, but actually put the for sale signs out on the front lawns, go to the other states, get a driver's license, reestablish roots, and they've permanently relocated. These are people who were born and raised in California, who have their roots in California, generations in California, and they had to go follow their job someplace else. And I think that's really the travesty of what's taken place here. And if anybody really wants to know what Detroit looked like in the 1980s, all you have to do is take a look around the film industry in Los Angeles today, because that's where we're heading unless something happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And just as an aside on that point, Tom, back in 2009, Amy Lemish and the Film Commission put together a little informational video when we were working on the first incentive to try to tell the human story of runaway production. And I think at IA's recommendation, they went to a few members' homes to film their story about their loss of work. Went to a camera operator in Northern California, third generation member of the industry, third generation camera operator. And when the film crew rolled up to his house, it wasn't planned, but he had the for sale sign in front of his house. He was picking up with his family, third generation member, moving to New Mexico because he could work there. And I think, for me, that once we lose that human infrastructure, once we lose that kind of talent and that kind of heritage and that kind of roots that this industry has there, it's no amount of money is going to be able to revive it once we've lost our most valuable asset, and that's our people. So thank you for being here. Our next speaker, and so far, and as of now, our last speaker, unless anybody else would like to fill out a card and bring it forward, is Ken Haber. Mr. Haber.
Hi there. I'd like to thank you for putting this committee together and for taking such a serious stance on a serious problem. We in the industry appreciate it. I'm a location manager. I've been doing it for about 30 years. I'm also on the board of the Location Managers Guild of America. And two of our members were really hoping to be here today. Problem is they're in Atlanta working on a movie that's supposed to take place in San Francisco. So this is a story you've heard over and over. It's a story we'll continue to hear as long as there are other regions, other states, other countries that have serious incentives, that's where the business is going to go. It's that simple. One of the things I just wanted to make clear here is that the lucky ones get to go out of town and work. The unlucky ones are the ones that are here and can't get work. However, it's generally the department heads that get to go, and if they're very lucky, they get to bring their key assistant. Everybody else in their crew stays here. They don't get to go on the job out of town. That's where the locals get hired. And eventually the keys won't go either, because there'll be people locally trained there that will know how to do their job. So I just wanted to bring that up. Another point is that maybe a way to sweeten the pot for Northern California with this state legislation is to create a bump in the incentive if films are shot up north, in which case that'll help the economy in the north, and maybe they might be more interested in bringing this to fruition. So everybody would benefit.
Just FYI, the current version of Assemblymember Bocanegra's bill does provide for an extra 5% outside the zone. Right. So hopefully most of that will stay in Southern California outside the zone, but it does provide for a little bit extra.
Great.
For that very reason. Thank you very much, sir. That is the last comment card I have. Mr. O'Farrell, any other thoughts or comments? All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for your participation today. We will be making recommendations to the council. The council has already taken a position in support of AB 1839, and in fact, thanks to Councilmember Fuentes, he and I wrote a letter to the League of California Cities, and the League of California Cities statewide has now also taken a position in support of this bill. That includes cities up and down the length of California, so that was a bit of good news. Our next hearing of this committee, the date has not yet been set, but if you've signed up on the clipboard, we will notify you, and the focus of the next hearing will be Los Angeles-based strategies that we can adopt here within LA to try to bring down the cost of production, make it easier to film here in the city. So with that, I thank you all for your attendance, and we are adjourned.